The room smelled faintly of roses and linen, but the air was heavy, almost suffocating. I sat at the edge of the long dining table, my hands folded in my lap, unnoticed except when plates were passed. My stepdaughter, smiled at everyone else, and then almost casually her eyes slid to me. "You're such a freeloader," she said, loud enough for some to hear, soft enough for others to question if they had. The words hung, but the laughter that followed wasn't mine. I didn't speak. I didn't move. Something in the corner of the room shifted, a subtle glance from a man I barely knew, but one that promised the truth was already closer than anyone expected. The mornings always began quietly. The house was still, the kind of still that makes small sounds louder than they should be. The hum of the fridge, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the soft scrape of my own shoes against the hardwood. I would make my coffee slowly, measuring each scoop with care, letting the water bloom over the grounds. It was routine. Safe, invisible. I had learned over years that being quiet was often safer than speaking, that observation carried more weight than argument. People underestimated me. They always had. My stepdaughter, her mother, even the new husband, they all treated me like a fixture rather than a person. I had long ago stopped correcting them. There was a rhythm to this life, one that I understood better than anyone around me, and for a while, that rhythm felt enough. Weekdays were predictable. I would arrive early to help with small tasks, setting the table for breakfast, folding napkins just so, keeping the living room tidy. No one thanked me, no one needed to. The work existed, and so did I, quietly present. I often watched her from the corner of the kitchen. My stepdaughter moved with an ease that drew attention naturally, a smile that made rooms brighter, gestures that seemed effortless. I remembered a time when I had tried to fit into that world openly, but I quickly learned that my presence was tolerated at best. I had retreated into the margins, and there I remained, safe from scrutiny but also unseen. Evenings followed the same pattern. Dinner was prepared in silence. I would stir sauces and roast vegetables while listening to the low murmur of conversations elsewhere in the house. Sometimes she would speak directly to me, polite, distant. I answered minimally. I had learned the weight of words. Too many and they could be twisted. Too few and I was invisible. Both were acceptable in their way. Trust was not earned by declarations here. It was a quiet observation of patterns. I knew how moods shifted, how conversations were steered, which smiles were genuine and which were strategic. It was during one of these evenings, in that quiet, orchestrated world, that the first small moment of trust had settled. Her father, my husband, had paused in the doorway of the kitchen, handing me a glass of wine with a glance that lingered longer than the moment required. "Thanks," I said quietly. No one else saw it, no one else needed to. But in that silent acknowledgement, a thread of something resembling trust had formed. It was fragile, nearly imperceptible, yet it mattered. Weekends were more complicated. The house filled with voices, with laughter and movement, with the distraction of visits and errands. I moved through it like a shadow, present enough to be helpful, distant enough to avoid interference. People laughed at things I had noticed before they said them aloud. A spill, a misplaced object, an overlooked invitation. I would notice. I would correct. No one ever noticed me doing it. The quiet labor of stability was my responsibility, silently accepted, rarely acknowledged. And I carried it willingly, because the alternative, confrontation, argument, exposure, always seemed heavier than my own restraint. Sometimes, late at night, when everyone else slept, I would sit alone at the edge of the dining table, staring at the faint reflection of light on the polished surface. I traced the scratches in the wood with my fingers, a map of small, invisible histories. Trust, I realized then, had many forms. Some were quiet, some were fragile. Some existed only in the small acknowledgement of presence. I had learned slowly to recognize them, to count them, to hold on to them, even when the world around me made it clear I was peripheral. I believed still that this world, our imperfect, delicate household, was stable, that the quiet constancy of my actions, my observances, my presence, had earned me a place within it. I believed in it because, for the first time in years, I had found a rhythm where my restraint felt like safety, where being unseen had its own kind of power. I trusted the system of small gestures, quiet duties, and unspoken agreements. That trust, I thought, was enough. But beneath the surface, something had already begun to shift. I didn't yet know how or when or why. The unease was small, almost imperceptible, like a thread pulling at the hem of a dress. I would not notice it fully for weeks. For now, I stayed at the edge, quiet, observing, trusted in the system I had built around myself, unaware that trust was the very thing that would be tested in ways I could not yet imagine. The first moments of unease were almost laughably small, a laugh that lingered too long, a glance that shifted just slightly when I entered a room. Subtle things, easy to dismiss if I hadn't learned to notice patterns over the years. Still, I noted them, quietly filing each one away like a ledger of discomfort I wasn't ready to confront. It began at breakfast. My stepdaughter, moved the cereal bowls around as if rehearsing for someone else's approval. I offered to pour the milk. "No, I've got it," she said, too quickly, her eyes flicking past me toward her mother. The word carried a note of tension I couldn't place, and yet I said nothing. I watched instead, silent, measuring the shift in tone, the stiff posture she assumed once my gaze left her. The room returned to its familiar hum, but the edge remained. Later, I found her mother in the living room, reviewing what seemed to be a stack of bills. "Did you see this?" she asked, handing me a paper. I nodded, scanning numbers, dates, and signatures. Nothing alarming jumped out at me. Still, her voice had carried a subtle sharpness that I couldn't place, and for a moment, I felt a fleeting sense of alienation, as if I had wandered into a conversation I wasn't meant to understand. I folded the paper carefully, returned it to the pile, and moved on. Observing was safer than commenting. The small signs persisted during the day. Invitations for family outings were extended without asking if I wanted to join. A phone call from a distant relative was whispered about in the kitchen, deliberately excluded from me. I didn't speak, didn't protest. I moved silently through the motions, quietly noting every exclusion, every subtle omission. There was a pattern forming, delicate and quiet, almost invisible, but I could feel it, like a tremor beneath a calm surface. At dinner, I noticed the shift most clearly. Conversations that once included me now passed me by. Her stepdaughter's laughter carried a hint of mockery I had never heard before, soft enough to be doubted if I mentioned it. Her friends arrived, and I offered to help with plates. "No need," one of them said, smiling politely but not at me. My hands hovered for a moment before I retreated, choosing silence over confrontation, recording the slight exclusion. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe I was imagining things, but the unease didn't leave. At night, when the house quieted, I replayed small moments. The fleeting eye contact avoided, the half smiles that never reached her eyes, the whispered comments I barely caught. They were minor incidents, easy for others to dismiss, and perhaps I should have done the same. But years of careful observation had taught me the truth. Minor inconsistencies often foreshadowed deeper fractures. Even the household routines seemed subtly altered. A chore I had performed for months was suddenly not necessary. A familiar habit was met with a glance that implied judgment rather than gratitude. I performed my duties regardless, but the invisible weight pressed more heavily than before. I realized that the quiet trust I had counted on was already starting to shift, though I didn't yet understand why. Small moments of kindness remained, of course. Her father paused to hand me a towel or offered a quiet nod in acknowledgement of a task completed. But even these gestures carried a new weight, almost as if they were compensations for unseen tensions. The house was no longer entirely predictable. The rhythm I had relied upon, the invisible network of duties, trust, and recognition, was starting to feel fragile. I didn't speak of any of it. I couldn't. There was power in restraint. In being quiet, I preserved the semblance of normalcy, even while the undercurrents shifted. I had learned that speaking prematurely invited misunderstanding or dismissal. So I remained observant, recording every small deviation in my mind. The way her glance flickered toward someone else when I entered a room, the subtle tightening of her smile, the pauses in conversation that felt like walls closing in around me. By the end of the week, the quiet discomfort had grown into a persistent undercurrent. I felt the subtle weight of being watched differently, of being measured and found. Peripheral. The first signs of exclusion, though minor, had set a tone I could not yet name. I went to bed as I always did, alone at the edge of the room, my hands folded over the thin blanket, listening to the distant hum of the house. There was no confrontation, no anger, only observation, quietly acknowledging that something had shifted. Something was wrong, and I could not yet intervene. The signs became harder to dismiss. What had once been subtle, the fleeting glance, the whispered comment, had grown into patterns that pressed against the edges of my awareness. I couldn't ignore them anymore. The rhythm of the household was no longer seamless. It carried fissures that betrayed something larger, something deliberate. It began one evening during dinner. I noticed a folded envelope left carelessly on the sideboard, its contents partially visible, receipts, a note, and signatures I did not recognize. My stepdaughter's hand hovered over it as if to claim it, but then she paused, her eyes scanning the room. She looked at me, then away, and the envelope was tucked quickly out of sight. I didn't speak. I didn't reach. I recorded the moment in quiet observation. Her hesitation, the concealment, it was the first unmistakable crack in the polite facade of civility. The next day, I overheard a conversation in the kitchen while cleaning. Her mother and her husband were speaking in low tones, voices dipped beneath the hum of the refrigerator. I could catch fragments. "He doesn't need to know. Make it seem normal. Just leave it." The sentences were clipped, precise, and deliberate. I froze, letting them finish. Silence was safer than intrusion, but my mind cataloged every word. Patterns repeated themselves. Trust, once my quiet refuge, was being manipulated, bent around something I had not yet been allowed to see fully. Small inconsistencies followed. Invitations that I had assumed were routine were suddenly rescinded without explanation. I noted how my stepdaughter avoided my gaze when discussing weekend plans, how her laughter didn't reach her eyes. There was a shift in tone, a calculated restraint in the way words were delivered around me. Each interaction seemed rehearsed, designed to maintain appearances while hiding intentions. The discomfort was no longer subtle. It pressed against the edges of my awareness like an uninvited shadow. One afternoon, I found a misplaced phone, its screen cracked and abandoned on the countertop. The lock screen displayed a message preview. "Don't let them see this. I told you." My stepdaughter's name flashed beneath the notification, though I couldn't see the sender. I set it down quietly, my hands trembling slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of recognition. The veneer of ordinary life was fragile. Beneath it, decisions were being made, manipulations enacted, and I had only begun to understand the scope. The pattern extended to small acts of exclusion. A group photo was taken on the porch, and I found myself just out of frame. Dinner plans were rearranged with no mention to me. Compliments flowed around the table but rarely landed on me. The smallest gestures, once neutral or unnoticed, now carried weight. Each omission, each slight was deliberate. My quiet awareness cataloged everything: who smiled at me genuinely, who avoided my presence, and who spoke just slightly louder to ensure I heard them but not fully. I began noticing her reactions when she thought she was unobserved. A smirk quickly hidden. A whispered remark to a friend, cut short when I turned my head. The small, repeated inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. The truth was not yet clear, but its presence was undeniable. The trust I had placed in the household, carefully maintained through years of restraint, had begun to erode. At night, I sat alone at the dining table again, tracing the faint scratches in the wood. Each mark had once represented stability, history, quiet understanding. Now they seemed like markers of subtle deception, reminders that appearances could be manipulated, that control was not always visible. I could feel the shift in power, quiet but deliberate, though I did not yet know its source or its full extent. I realized then that my own presence, once a stabilizing, invisible force, had become irrelevant in the schemes of those around me. Observing, I understood, would be my only defense. Reacting openly would have invited dismissal or ridicule. The signs, though small, were consistent. The secrecy, the exclusion, the careful calibration of words. They all pointed to a larger pattern, one that I could sense but not yet confront. The first red flags were now fully visible. I did not speak. I did not accuse. I simply observed. Every glance, every whispered word, every careful avoidance of eye contact became a record, quietly building a ledger of truth. The world I had once trusted, the small network of routines and silent acknowledgments that had given me a sense of safety, was no longer reliable. Something had shifted, something deliberate, and I understood that my role was no longer passive. Not yet active, but aware. A storm was forming beneath the calm, and I was the one who had already noticed it. The first time it hit me fully, I felt it in the quiet weight pressing against my chest. A remark, casual to anyone else, landed like a stone in water, rippling outward. "You're imagining things," my stepdaughter said one evening, her tone light, almost dismissive. "It's not like that. You're just sensitive." She smiled at me as she said it, as if the accusation were a kindness rather than a dismissal. I froze, saying nothing, though the air between us grew suddenly colder. It wasn't a single incident. The gaslighting began as a pattern, subtle at first, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying attention. I would mention the envelope, the conversation I had overheard, or the way a plan had changed without notice. "You misheard," her mother would say. "It wasn't like that. Don't make things bigger than they are." Their words were precise, clipped, almost rehearsed, as if they had prepared these corrections in advance. My own memory of events was questioned, twisted, and reframed. Dinner became a theater of controlled appearances. Conversations flowed, laughter echoed, and I was present but marginalized. When I hesitated over a serving or offered to help with a dish, my stepdaughter would remark loudly enough for the others to hear, "Are you even paying attention?" Her friends laughed politely, the kind of laughter that didn't belong to warmth but to obligation. I remained still. I had learned restraint long before this moment, but the weight of dismissal pressed harder now. Each word, each glance, each calculated smile chipped away at the quiet trust I had held onto. Even the smallest household interactions carried this subtle pressure. A chore I had performed for months, arranging flowers, polishing silver, setting the table, was suddenly pointed out as wrong or overdone. "You're making it worse," her mother said one evening, folding napkins I had spent minutes aligning. "It doesn't need to be perfect." I nodded, silently correcting the error, but the sting of being undermined lingered. The house no longer offered the rhythm of stability. Every task was a test, every smile a potential weapon. Sometimes I caught glances that confirmed my suspicions. The new husband, seated at the edge of the dining room, would watch me with a polite neutrality that didn't reach his eyes. There was distance there, the kind that spoke of judgment without accusation. His observation, though silent, felt heavier than any words of mockery. He didn't need to speak. His quiet acknowledgement of my marginalization was enough. Power, I realized, was rarely loud. It existed in the gaze, the positioning, the unspoken decisions that shaped the room. Attempts to question their behavior were met with layered denial. I would start a sentence, recounting an incident, and it would be preemptively reframed. "You're overthinking it," her mother would say, her voice calm, almost soothing. "We didn't mean anything by it." The effect was cumulative. My own perception of reality was eroded, replaced by their version of events. Each attempt to assert my truth was met with polite dismissal, a subtle form of control that was both infuriating and isolating. It wasn't just words. Actions reinforced the narrative. Invitations I assumed I would receive were quietly rerouted. Plans I thought were mutual were confirmed without me. Compliments and attention flowed to others, often for efforts I had quietly undertaken. The household had become a stage, and I was relegated to the backdrop, unseen and unheard. Even when I tried to participate, my presence was reframed as intrusive, a problem rather than a contributor. I spent nights replaying these moments in silence. The ledger of behaviors, the patterns of exclusion, the careful calibration of every interaction, they were all there, undeniable, though I could not yet act on them. I felt the subtle psychological cost, the weight of constant correction, the slow erosion of self-assurance. The world I had once trusted, built from quiet observation and consistent effort, was now a site of manipulation and dismissal. And yet I restrained myself. I did not shout. I did not accuse. I did not react. The lessons of years of being underestimated, of observing quietly, of weighing the long-term cost of confrontation guided me. I understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that power could be subtle. It could be administered through words, glances, omissions, and corrections. And I, though marginalized, was learning the contours of that power, quietly, with observation as my only tool. By the end of the week, I could no longer doubt it. Gaslighting was now a constant, invisible presence. Every interaction carried the risk of distortion, every word potentially reframed. Trust, that fragile lifeline I had held onto, had been destabilized. The signs were undeniable. I could feel the shift not just in the household, but in myself. Restraint had become survival. Silence had become armor. And beneath it all, I knew. The truth, as small and hidden as it was, had not yet been lost. The first cracks in the carefully maintained facade came from the smallest, most unassuming sources. I began noticing inconsistencies that couldn't be explained away, little slips that hinted at the reality I had been too cautious to confront directly. It started with a misplaced receipt, folded neatly between the pages of a magazine I had set aside days before. The handwriting was familiar, precise, deliberate, yet the context made no sense. I didn't reach for it immediately. I watched quietly as my stepdaughter entered the room, glanced at the magazine, and then hesitated, her hand hovering for a moment over the hidden note before withdrawing. That pause, that flicker of awareness, spoke volumes. Later, while helping clear the dining table, I noticed her phone lying face down on the counter. A notification blinked faintly before disappearing. Curiosity had never been my habit, but my instincts, honed by months of observation, insisted I notice. The brief glimpse I caught, a partial message and a timestamp inconsistent with what had been said, was enough to confirm what I had suspected. There was communication happening behind carefully constructed walls, information hidden from me, interactions denied by the household's polite, controlled decorum. I replaced the phone exactly as I had found it, recording in silence every detail, every discrepancy. Witnesses appeared unexpectedly. A friend of the family, someone I had considered neutral, let slip a comment that didn't match the official narrative. I was arranging glasses when the words reached me. "It's strange how things always work out without you noticing, isn't it?" I froze, the glass in my hand half raised. There was no accusation, only implication. Yet the meaning was clear. Someone else had observed the manipulation, too, and it existed beyond my own perception. It was no longer invisible. Even the systems in place, bank statements, schedules, small household logs I had maintained for years, began offering subtle proof. A payment I hadn't authorized, a delivery that wasn't explained, a plan shifted without record, all hinted at a larger truth. The betrayal wasn't overt. It didn't announce itself in dramatic confrontations. Instead, it revealed itself in the careful misalignment of everyday events, in gaps between words and actions, in records that spoke louder than anyone in the room. My observations were finally converging with evidence, each silent piece building toward clarity. Her behavior began to crack under its own weight. I noticed her smiles were occasionally delayed, rehearsed. She would start a story or explanation, then catch herself, redirecting, refining, adjusting to fit a version that would withstand scrutiny. The effort was meticulous but not perfect. Human nature leaked through the cracks, and I watched, silently understanding the stakes. Every word spoken, every gesture made, was part of a delicate performance designed to maintain the illusion. Yet in those small imperfections, the truth was seeping out. One afternoon, I found a notebook tucked between the couch cushions. It wasn't mine, and the entries were personal, detailed, and damning in their subtlety. I read quietly, tracing the handwriting, the careful notation of meetings, conversations, and intentional omissions. I felt no satisfaction, only a calm recognition that the world I had trusted had been manipulated. The ledger of hidden truths lay before me, and I understood that exposure was partial but inevitable. Evidence, witnesses, and systems were aligning in ways no one could fully control. I began to see the quiet patterns of power. She, my stepdaughter, and her mother had relied on controlled narratives, careful misdirection, and the assumption that I would remain invisible. They underestimated the discipline that restraint cultivates. I observed without interruption, cataloging every move, every reaction. Each slip, each misaligned record, each inadvertent glance was a signal. The truth existed, and it would not remain hidden forever. The psychological cost was heavy. I felt the weight of watching without confrontation, of knowing without being able to speak. There was a subtle tension in every room, every shared meal, every passing glance. I had to maintain composure to preserve the guise of calm participation while quietly absorbing the reality of betrayal. The restraint demanded of me was both exhausting and necessary. Any overt reaction would have been dismissed, laughed at, reframed. Silence was my only leverage. Yet, even as I recorded the evidence and observed the inconsistencies, a small measure of relief accompanied the discovery. Partial exposure meant that the deception was no longer absolute. The cracks could be seen, even if only by me. The carefully constructed power dynamics, previously impenetrable, were now vulnerable. I could sense the edges fraying, the careful narrative faltering. By the end of the week, the household had shifted subtly. The same polite smiles, the same rehearsed gestures carried a new tension. Unseen forces, the truths hidden in receipts, notes, and whispered observations were now quietly at work. I did not speak. I did not confront. But I knew without doubt that the world had changed. Partial exposure had occurred. The machinery of betrayal, once hidden and absolute, was now vulnerable to observation, and I was the only one patient enough, quiet enough to see it. The ledger of hidden truths had begun to form, and with it came a sense of inevitability. The quiet, restrained truth I had preserved for months was now emerging. Not fully revealed, but undeniable. The pattern was clear. Betrayal existed. And though no one else could yet see it, I knew the first cracks had appeared. The system was fragile, and the consequences, quiet, measured, inevitable, were already beginning to take shape. The air in the house had changed. What had once been subtle discomfort, then quiet realization, now pressed against the walls like a storm waiting to break. The cracks were widening, small slips becoming impossible to ignore, and those responsible for the deception were beginning to react. I could feel it in the tension of glances, the hesitations in speech, the micro-adjustments of posture around me. It began at dinner. I arrived early, placing the cutlery and glasses with practiced precision. My stepdaughter entered with a controlled smile, but her movements were sharper than usual, her laughter clipped. I noticed how she avoided the usual trajectory of her glance toward me, the habitual acknowledgement replaced by something rehearsed, calculated. When her father asked a simple question about a shared household errand, she answered with a slight exaggeration, her words carefully designed to mask the truth I had begun uncovering. There was a tension in her tone, subtle but undeniable, a strain beneath the casual surface. Later that evening, I found her mother in the kitchen, rifling through documents that had once been organized. She looked up, startled, though she quickly masked it with a smile. "Just checking a few things," she said, too quickly. I noticed the way her eyes darted to the stack of receipts I had quietly cataloged over the past weeks. The unease was palpable. Something had shifted. They had sensed that I had begun seeing through the patterns, that the partial exposure I had discovered was no longer hidden from my perception alone. The tension escalated in small, deliberate ways. Invitations were delayed, subtly redirected. Words were sharpened, conversations clipped, laughter that once flowed naturally now measured and controlled. My presence, once quietly tolerated, had become an irritant, a reminder of truths they could no longer fully conceal. I remained silent, observing. Restraint had become both my shield and my strategy. Every gesture I made, every careful movement was measured. The smallest reaction could be twisted, reframed, used against me. At one point, I overheard a whispered conversation between her stepdaughter and a friend, conducted in the corner of the living room. The words were carefully guarded, but fragments carried weight. "He's noticing. We have to cover it. Make it seem accidental." They didn't realize I was within earshot, yet I was not eavesdropping in the usual sense. I was observing, noting patterns, silently recording the escalation of control and manipulation. Each sentence confirmed the growing desperation beneath the polished exterior. Power, I realized, was no longer subtle. The household's system of control was tightening, almost reflexively. They reacted to my awareness with precision, attempting to restore balance in their favor. Instructions were redirected, interactions subtly constrained, and the micromanagement of appearances intensified. Even casual glances became tools, carefully measured, as if the entire family had rehearsed their responses to ensure no further cracks would appear. But the effort to contain the unraveling only made the pattern more visible to me, each carefully constructed lie slightly misaligned. I began noticing how small acts of sabotage were designed to undermine my confidence. A dish left unwashed until I arrived. A misplaced note implying forgetfulness. A casual comment about my sensitivity, delivered just loud enough for others to register. These were not random acts. They were deliberate calibrations, subtle attempts to reassert dominance in a system where I had quietly begun to understand the hidden mechanics. The stakes were rising. I had seen the patterns before, recognized the power imbalance, but now the force of it was directed outward, aimed at containment. Despite this, I did not react openly. I maintained composure, allowing the household to believe their strategies were effective. The cost was quiet but profound, an ever-present tension, a careful measurement of my own movements and words, the weight of knowing more than I could reveal. Every slip they made, every moment of desperation was noted, catalogued, and preserved. I was accumulating evidence, not for confrontation, but for the eventual unfolding of consequences. One night, alone in the dining room, I reviewed my mental ledger, receipts, notes, whispered words, fleeting gestures. Each item confirmed the pattern. The deception was intentional, the exclusion deliberate, and the power imbalance carefully maintained. Yet their attempt to escalate control only provided further clarity. The more they pushed, the more visible the cracks became. The tension, palpable to anyone attuned, hung in the air like a weight, pressing against the calm I had cultivated. By the end of the week, the escalation was undeniable. Their subtle manipulations had grown sharper, their efforts to control the narrative more aggressive. I could sense their frustration at my continued silence, at my ability to observe without reacting. And yet, I remained restrained. I did not confront. I did not accuse. My presence alone, quiet, measured, attentive, was becoming a counterbalance to their attempts at domination. I understood the rules of this system. Power was revealed not through shouting, not through confrontation, but through observation, through patience, and through the quiet accumulation of truth. The household, once predictable and carefully orchestrated, had become a pressure cooker of misaligned intentions. I had seen the first cracks. I had seen the partial exposures. Now, as their reactions intensified, I understood the stakes more fully. The deception was collapsing under its own weight, and I was ready to bear witness. The storm had arrived. Not loud, not dramatic, but precise. Quiet, controlled, and inevitable. I remained seated at the edge, hands folded, mind cataloging every movement, every word, every misstep. The game had changed. The stakes were higher. And I, as always, observed in silence, waiting for the consequences to arrive. By the time I reached this point, the weight of observation had grown heavier than the world around me. Each day, each interaction, each small calculated slight left traces, lines of quiet erosion that could no longer be ignored. I knew the truth, and yet I remained silent. That silence had a cost, but the alternative, speaking too soon, revealing what I had learned, would have allowed them to spin it, manipulate it, and bury the evidence again. Restraint had become my only shield, but it was exhausting, both emotionally and morally. The breaking point did not arrive with confrontation. It came slowly, in small, accumulating moments that left me hollow and tired. I watched her, My stepdaughter, laugh with friends, her gestures precise, her expressions rehearsed. The words she had spoken to others now carried a new weight, their duplicity impossible to ignore. I had catalogued the evidence, receipts, hidden messages, half-spoken remarks, inconsistencies in stories that no one could deny if they paid attention. And yet I could not act. I could not reveal it. There were nights when I lay awake, listening to the house breathe, the faint creaks of footsteps, the hum of air in the vents. I traced in my mind the ledger of betrayal, each small act accumulating into an undeniable pattern. I recognized the moral and emotional cost, the quiet injustice, the humiliation, the feeling of being deliberately diminished in a household that should have been safe. The betrayal was systemic, invisible to outsiders, yet overwhelming to someone who had observed it closely for months. One evening, as dinner ended and the last glasses were cleared, my stepdaughter passed me in the hallway. Her words, meant to sting, barely grazed me this time. "You're just always so unnecessary." A pause, a smirk, and she walked on. I did not reply. I did not flinch. Inside, a quiet storm raged, a torrent of recognition and moral understanding, but I kept my composure. The temptation to correct, to accuse, to reveal was strong, but I knew the cost would outweigh the fleeting satisfaction. The truth, I realized, had its own timing. It could not be forced. The breaking point crystallized when I found her mother at her desk, sorting through bills and hidden notes. Our eyes met, and for a fraction of a second I saw the recognition in her gaze, acknowledgement that I knew, that I understood, that I had pieced together what they had tried so hard to conceal. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of consequence. The realization struck me. I had reached a moral threshold. I understood fully what had been done, and I recognized the emotional toll it demanded. In that moment, I made a choice. I would not act rashly. I would not seek confrontation or revenge. I would preserve the evidence, the observations, the ledger of truths carefully assembled over months. My power lay not in outbursts, but in patience. The psychological weight was mine to bear, the restraint mine to wield. Every slight, every omission, every whispered lie had been documented in my memory, stored like a record that could not be altered. Even as I held myself in check, I felt the quiet cost of the truth. The betrayal, once subtle, had become undeniable, and yet I carried it without outward sign. I felt the moral tension tighten with each passing day, the knowledge that I had seen more than anyone else, and that my presence, quiet and restrained, was the only thing balancing the house's carefully constructed narrative. My emotional self was fractured, stretched thin by observation and patience, but I understood that to act now would be to relinquish control of the story I alone could bear witness to. I began to recognize the full scope of what had been done. The exclusion, the manipulation, the calculated diminishment, all were intentional, sustained, and precise. I felt a quiet anger tempered by understanding. Anger without action, recognition without reaction. That, I realized, was the true weight of the breaking point. It was not explosive. It was not dramatic. It was an internal reckoning, an acceptance of the cost of truth, of knowledge, of moral awareness. And so I remained quiet. I continued to participate in the household, unnoticed yet fully aware. Each movement, each word, each nod and smile was measured. I observed, catalogued, and restrained myself. The moral and emotional breaking point had not broken me outwardly. It had sharpened me inwardly, attuned me to the subtle systems of betrayal, and prepared me for the eventual unveiling of consequences that I knew, inevitably, would arrive. By the end of the week, I understood the full truth. Restraint was my weapon, patience my leverage, and observation my power. I had reached the breaking point not by losing control, but by taking full ownership of what I had seen, what I had documented, and what I would carry forward. The betrayal existed. The cost was clear. And yet the consequences were still unfolding, quietly, in the spaces between words, in the gestures, in the misaligned intentions of those who believed themselves untouchable. I had chosen my stance. I would not speak rashly. I would not demand recognition. I would bear witness, silently and fully, until the moment when truth itself, slow, inevitable, and undeniable, revealed the consequences in its own way. My restraint was no longer passive. It was deliberate, heavy, and essential. The breaking point had been reached, but it had strengthened me, focused me, and clarified the quiet power of observation. The truth, when it began to unfold, did so quietly, almost imperceptibly, but with a weight that could not be ignored. It did not arrive with accusations or confrontation. There was no shouting, no dramatic revelation. Instead, the evidence I had patiently observed over months, receipts, notes, subtle inconsistencies, and whispered admissions, began to align. Systems that had been manipulated, schedules that had been rewritten, and omissions that had been deliberate all converged, undeniable. The household's carefully maintained illusion was fraying at the edges. It started with small recognitions from outsiders. A relative visiting for dinner noticed a discrepancy in accounts, a subtle imbalance in plans. Their question, polite and indirect, carried more weight than anything anyone inside the house could articulate. They asked about schedules and receipts I had quietly catalogued. The reaction from her mother and stepdaughter was immediate. Forced smiles, clipped words, glances that darted between each other. I said nothing. I only observed. Their unease, now visible, confirmed the accuracy of my records. At first, the destabilization was minor, a forgotten note, an overlooked message, but it escalated quickly. The partial exposures I had catalogued in silence began to take root in the world beyond my own observation. Friends and family who had previously been unaware began asking questions, noticing inconsistencies, commenting on behaviors that had once gone unquestioned. The careful performance of normalcy could not withstand the scrutiny of multiple witnesses, even if no one directly confronted the perpetrators. Her stepdaughter, who had wielded words as weapons for so long, now found herself hemmed in by the truth. A compliment misdirected, a story repeated with missing details, a ledger of receipts finally cross-referenced, all pointed to actions she could not deny. The controlled smiles faltered. The subtle power she had exerted over the household began to slip. I watched quietly, noting the momentary hesitation in her gestures, the brief flicker of recognition that the house's reality was no longer entirely under her command. Her mother, too, experienced the quiet unraveling. A minor administrative oversight, a payment left unrecorded, a note overlooked, became visible to others in ways that exposed intent without direct accusation. The carefully maintained hierarchy of control, long dependent on the marginalization of my presence, began to collapse. Each slip, each imperfection, each moment of misalignment reinforced what I had already known. Their authority had been carefully constructed, but it was not infallible. I did not celebrate. I did not comment. I did not gloat. The consequences were subtle but real, appearing in the eyes of those who could see the disruption, in the whispered questions, and in the small shifts of body language. The ledger I had maintained silently for months, the catalog of inconsistencies, omissions, and small betrayals, was vindicated, but not in a dramatic way. Its validation came through observation by others, by patterns that could no longer be ignored, by the quiet consequences of misaligned actions. The psychological weight of watching remained. Even as the world around them began to acknowledge discrepancies, I carried the memory of months of betrayal, of gaslighting, of exclusion. There was no relief in the recognition of truth, only the quiet acknowledgement that patience and restraint had revealed the reality more effectively than confrontation ever could. The cost had been mine alone, borne silently, but the outcome confirmed the accuracy of my observation and the depth of the deception. By midweek, the tension had shifted noticeably. Her stepdaughter's rehearsed expressions faltered in the presence of friends who had begun asking pointed, indirect questions. Her mother's control over the household routines began to weaken, subtle but undeniable. Even her father, who had once maintained polite neutrality, glanced more often toward me, recognition flickering in his eyes. The quiet consequences were cascading through the household, unfolding without fanfare, yet fully visible to those who paid attention. I remained on the periphery, restrained, quiet, fully aware. Each small recognition, each subtle unraveling confirmed the ledger I had maintained. There was no dramatic victory, no celebratory confrontation. The truth revealed itself through consequences that were calm, measured, and undeniable. Patterns that had been hidden could no longer be ignored. The household's power dynamics, once meticulously controlled, were now destabilized by the weight of observation, evidence, and truth. By the end of the week, the consequences were clear. The deception had been exposed, though quietly. The controlled narrative, once absolute, was fractured. Those who had wielded power through exclusion and manipulation were forced to confront a reality that could no longer be denied. And through it all, I remained silent, restrained, and fully aware, a witness to the truth, bearing its weight with quiet resolve, knowing that the consequences had arrived on their own terms, without dramatics, without spectacle, but with clarity that could not be disputed. The house was quieter than it had been in months. Conversations flowed without the subtle tension that had gripped every room. Smiles returned, but they were measured, restrained, careful, like the acknowledgement of a storm that had passed without anyone claiming credit for its clearing. The ledger of truths I had maintained, the months of observation, cataloging, and restraint had done its work. The consequences had arrived, silently but unmistakably. I moved through the rooms as I always had, quietly performing small tasks, placing glasses, folding napkins, adjusting chairs. Nothing had changed outwardly. No one sought to confront me, no one offered apologies, no declarations of guilt were made. That was not the point. The exposure had worked in its own way, subtle, undeniable, and final. The power imbalance had shifted, but it was a quiet, invisible shift, acknowledged only in glances, in pauses, in the unspoken recognition of truth. She, my stepdaughter, avoided my eyes more often now. The smiles that once carried mockery were restrained, cautious, as if she had finally measured the impact of her words and actions. Her mother, too, moved differently, less controlling, less certain. The household had not collapsed, but the invisible architecture of manipulation had been destabilized. I felt no triumph. No vindication would have felt deserved after the months of subtle torment, gaslighting, and exclusion. There was only a calm recognition of what had been borne silently, patiently, and accurately observed. The ledger remained in my mind, a record of truth that no one could erase, a quiet monument to the patience required to witness betrayal without reacting impulsively. I sat at the edge of the dining table that night, tracing the familiar scratches in the wood. The house hummed softly around me, the storm gone, but its echoes lingering. No one spoke. No one needed to. The aftermath was quiet, heavy, and earned. The truth had revealed itself subtly, deliberately, and I was the only one fully aware of its scale. The story had ended, not with spectacle, not with confrontation, but with quiet acknowledgement of reality, and with the weight of what had been endured, observed, and preserved. The world outside might never know. Inside, the consequences were absolute.